Louise Ryan, and I'm Director of the new Research Centre for Global Diversities and Inequalities. And it's my great pleasure to now hand over to Lynn Dobbs, who is the Vice-Chancellor of London Metropolitan University, who's going to do the official welcome. Thanks, Lynn.
Hello, everyone. Before I start, I'd just like to apologise. My smoke alarm has developed a life of its own. I think I've stopped it beeping, but if it starts again, my apologies. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, a huge pleasure. We are growing research at London Met and we're proud to say that. And the Centre represents the focal point of our area studies ref submission and a surefire marker of our seriousness in the fields that make up this interdisciplinary field of research. Some of our best known and our most promising scholars are members of this centre, ably led by Professor Louise Ryan and María López. These two colleagues lead the way in interrogating the themes of the centre. I would like to thank Louise and María for the invitation and so declare with pride and excitement that the centre is now launched. And over to Don MacRaild, who, as well as our PVC for research and knowledge exchange, is also a historian and a member of this centre. Don.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I think I've said it before, but I think I'll say it again. We actually owe you a great debt of gratitude. It's true, the university is supporting research after a fallow period, but without your personal drive behind this, I guess many of us wouldn't be here. The centre might be here, but it also more likely wouldn't be, and Louise and I wouldn't be here. And I think that we all of us are grateful for the support you've given us, and it is making a big difference and will make a bigger difference to our community. Now, the centre, GDI, if you don't mind me saying that, is a great idea. And Louise and María have worked tirelessly over the summer to get this going. Maeva in the research office has supported them all the way. And the sort of sense of community coming together is already very apparent. There's such a lot of energy around this centre already. It's brought together people who know each other, but also people who previously didn't know each other. It's brought together seasoned scholars, many of whom have worked at London Met for years and decades, but it's also brought in people who are new to this institution. It's led by Louise, who's really widely experienced in leading teams with research grants, came to us from Sheffield, where she also ran a centre, has similar experience in Middlesex and other places. And you can see this sense of already in a strong existing leadership. But also María is someone who I think is becoming more and more prominent in our institution. She's been here a long while, and it's a pleasure working with both of them, not just here in the wider sense, looking after PGRs, looking after research, and actually with Louise, working on a particular project, which I'll say something about in a second. But already you see, before the launch, there's a seminar program taking shape. There are external partners being garnered, and postgraduate training is also being offered. This centre is going to make a big contribution. It's already got a strong profile, and the themes that it's interested in fit right at the heart of what you might call the London Met problematic and maybe the modern society problematic in relation to inequality, diversity, both globally and here in Britain. It brings together people who are working on some of these cutting edge themes, which they've been doing for years, but they have this new imperative, this new relevance now, I think. And I just want to share one small example of the kinds of things that can happen when scholars like you come together in a centre like this under the guidance of colleagues like Louise and María. Louise and I have known each other. I can't remember when we first were on the same bill at a conference, but it's at least 20 years ago, I'd say, a long while anyway. And we work, we have one shared area of research interest, and we've known each other for a long time. We decided to take a punt at the HRC with an idea around COVID actions, looking at the racism faced by the Chinese and comparing it with historic anti-Irish behaviour, racism, ethnocentrism and so on. They said no, but then they said come back to us with something for the major routes. In other words, a bigger thing. It's quite exciting, though we don't we'll never know really why they did that, but it's still quite exciting. But that's not the story. The story is that we need to grow this bid to make it bigger. We've got more ambitions. We were limited with funding for the first thing. Now we can think on broader vistas and larger horizons. And we want to do some quantitative things that I really can't do, and Louise probably can do them, or to some extent anyway. But actually, we need a specialist who deals with corpus linguistics, the search for terms, meanings, expressions in mass data, whether the web, Twitter, or newspapers. Now, I wouldn't have known, I guess, about Gordana Usalek's research unless she'd given a paper at the Interdisciplinary Research Forum. But the fact that she did lit a light bulb above my head, and Louise and I have talked, and now the three of us, along with an external partner at Toynbee Hall, will be moving things forward with this bid. You know, this is just an example of the sort of thing that can happen when people from different disciplines across a university, even remotely in COVID times, meet up, hear what each other have to say, and realise that there are these eureka moments. And I think this is one of them. And I think this centre will do that kind of thing for other people as well. You know, I don't just hope that the GDI will have a similar effect. I know it will. I don't just hope that it will become a home for many scholars. It already is a home for scholars. It will become a hothouse, a sounding board, a seminar room. It will help us all make new associations, but most of all, it will enhance our sense of intellectual community. But that's enough from me for now. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague, María López, to introduce our speakers. And thank you both very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for getting this off the ground. I'm so looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great work. I'm going to introduce our speakers for today's presentation, for today's lunch. This is Professor Lynn, Professor Mary Hickman. I'm going to introduce, I think she's in. I'm going to read a bit about herself. And Mary Hickman is adjunct professor in the Maynooth University Social Science Institute and Professor Emeritus at London Metropolitan University. She established the Irish Studies Centre at London Metropolitan in 1986, where she was also director of the Institute for the Study of European Transformations from 2002 to 2012. She was professorial research fellow at the Centre of Irish Studies at Mary University, Twickenham, London, between 2012 to 2016. Professor Hickman has written widely on Irish emigration and diaspora, especially the Irish in Britain. She is co-author of Migration and Social Cohesion in the UK and co-editor of Women and Irish Diaspora Identity with Manchester University Press in 2014. Her current research focuses on the Irish in America. She is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK and chair of the campaign Votes for Irish Citizens Abroad, based in London. And I'm introducing Louise Ryan. Should we just hear Mary and then I introduce Louise? Yeah.
No, our presentation is joint. So if you introduce us both, sorry, Maria. Thank you.
Okay, that's right. Louise Ryan is Professor of Sociology at London Metropolitan University. She joined in June this year, having previously been Professor of Sociology at the University of Sheffield. Louise has published widely on a variety of aspects of migration, but has a particular interest in social networks and is one of the leading exponents of qualitative network analysis. She's currently writing a monograph on migrant networks in London, as well as co-editing a book on migrant networks and access to the labour market across diverse European countries. She's also currently guest editing 2 journal special issues with colleagues on qualitative social network analysis and another on ethics in social networks research. Louise has recently completed work on a large ESRC grant on aging and care and is currently part of a large Horizon 2020 consortium in young migrants across 10 European countries. And then we've got Sunny Singh, who's been with us for such a long time, and she will read later when we finish this presentation. So I'll introduce her later. Mary, Louise, up to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Maria. So Mary and I are going to give a joint presentation, and I'm going to start, and then Mary will follow on immediately afterwards. So the title of our presentation is Myopia and Marginalisation in British Sociology of Migration and Ethnic and Racial Studies. So I hope everybody can see the slides. Maria, can somebody tell me if you can see the slides okay?
We can.
Yep.
Yes, yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so to start off, we wanted to really talk about the relevance of these ongoing issues, and we couldn't really find any more pertinent example than the current Brexit negotiations. And as if by magic, Boris obliged us by putting this right back in the news last week when he was threatening to rewrite, or rather break, an internationally binding legal agreement in relation to the Brexit deal with the EU. So that was very good from our point of view. Not that he was breaking international law, but it sort of reinforced our point about the salience of these issues. And what the Brexit negotiations have really done is to shine a light on the ongoing salience of Northern Ireland, and particularly around the sensitivities of the border. Now, I think it's fair to say that the importance of Northern Ireland in the EU Brexit negotiations may have come as a surprise to many people, including, unfortunately, some British politicians. An example of this is the former Minister of State for Northern Ireland, ironically enough, Karen Bradley, when she admitted that she didn't actually know that a nationalist wouldn't vote for a unionist, or that a unionist wouldn't vote for a nationalist. This was kind of new information for her, which was a bit unfortunate given her portfolio. And the man himself, Boris Johnson, while he was Foreign Secretary, while commenting on the EU requirement for a backstop in dealing with the Northern Ireland border issue in the Brexit negotiations, actually referred to this as the folly of the tail wagging the dog, which really shows a level of arrogance, but also a lack of understanding around the enormous economic and political importance of these issues pertaining to the border. And unfortunately, this lack of awareness was made even more explicit when he likened the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland to that of the boundaries between the London Borough of Camden and Westminster for congestion charging purposes. So really a level of ignorance that is quite astounding in somebody who was Foreign Secretary, but who is now Prime Minister and in charge of these negotiations. And when you sort of see those quotes from him, we begin to understand some of what may have informed his actions over the last couple of weeks in relation to the Northern Irish border issue. Now, the ignorance about Ireland, or the tendency to downgrade the significance of all things Irish, does not solely reside in the minds and attitudes of what has been called the British chumocracy. I hadn't come across this word chumocracy before, but I think it very well describes the kind of public schooled, Oxford educated men primarily who are heavily overrepresented in British politics at the present time. However, this level of ignorance about Ireland also, unfortunately, extends into academic circles in Britain. And this is a theme that we explore at the nexus of the sociology of migration and of race and ethnic studies. Now, of course, if you look at histories of migration to Britain, you do, of course, find references to the high prevalence of Irish migrants, particularly in the 19th and perhaps even in the early 20th century. But if you look beyond history, if you look at sociology, for example, or even at migration studies more broadly and race and ethnic studies, it's apparent that far less attention has been paid to the very large scale level of Irish migration to Britain in the mid to late 20th century. So when you're reading texts about migration since World War II, there's rarely any serious engagement with the Irish migrants of that period. It may perhaps just be a footnote or a passing reference. So in this presentation today, we are drawing on an article that Mary and I published earlier this year I think it came out in about January 2020. And the title of that article was The Irish Question, Marginalisations at the Nexus of Sociology of Migration and Ethnic and Racial Studies in Britain, which appropriately enough was published in Ethnic and Racial Studies Open Access. And we were really pleased with the response to that paper. It's had very large numbers of downloads. And for those of you who are interested in those kinds of things, it has an extraordinarily high altmetric score, which largely, I think, is derived from Twitter. We were very pleased with this paper because I don't think Mary will mind me saying, but this was a paper that we wrote over a very long period of time. And it was a paper that we put a lot of thought into. And indeed, when we started writing the paper, Brexit wasn't even on the political horizon. So that will tell you the time that we put into developing and writing the paper. And in fact, when Brexit happened, it actually made the topic of the paper even more relevant. So obviously in today's presentation, we haven't got time to discuss the entire paper. We would hope that those of you who are interested would go and check out the paper. It is open access, but we just want to deal with some of the issues today briefly. So in particular, the aims are to challenge the historical myopia which underpins many studies at the nexus of sociology of migration and ethnic and racial studies in Britain, considering the British colonial legacy, which is the theme of today's presentation, in Ireland through the persistence of the Irish border and ongoing tensions around partition, and the experiences of Irish migrants in Britain, and focusing on the Irish as historically the largest migrant group to Britain. And so to the which questions the assumptions around migration as being a recent problem, and I'm doing inverted commas if you can't see me, and that migrants are people who have predominantly brown or black skins. So we're really engaging with many of these assumptions. So very briefly, just to say that in the post-1945 period, Irish migrants were consistently the largest incoming group until the final decades of the 20th century. Between 50,000 and 60,000 people from the Irish Republic arrived every year through the 1950s. So that's really quite astounding. That is the number arriving every year through the 1950s. And we saw substantial re-emergence of migration from Ireland following the recession in the 80s and again the recession in 2008-9. However, Irish migration has not been subject to sustained analysis by English-British sociology, probably for two main reasons, which Mary will expand on. But just to say briefly that it's possible that Irish migrants have not been seen as proper migrants, and they have not been perceived as part of the race relations problem as defined by official discourse and duly analysed by academia, due to their presumed whiteness and cultural similarity. And I'll now hand over to Mary.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, not being seen as proper migrants. I mean, essentially what we're arguing is that although Irish migrants to Britain accrue a number of advantages from EU membership, citizenship since the, whenever it was, 70s, and also from the benefits derived from the arrangements between the British and Irish states through the common travel area, despite that, there have been good reasons for the sociology of migration and the sociology of ethnic and racial studies to give attention to Irish migration and the Irish in Britain. And we'll obviously touch on a few here. It's expanded in much more detail in the paper. Now, for a little bit of history, because, you know, an ahistorical approach really isn't tenable anymore with looking, I don't think, at migration and ethnic and racial studies. And I'm only going back about 70 years. In 1948, Ireland declared itself a republic and severed links with the Crown and the Commonwealth, even though Irish independence in a way is usually dated from 1922, Ireland had remained part of the Commonwealth. And in 1949, in response, the Westminster Parliament passed the Ireland Act, partly under pressure from other Commonwealth countries, partly because of the need for Irish Labour, partly because the Labour Party, who were in power then, in fact depended on Irish votes in many major cities in Britain. But this act was passed, and it was very extraordinary because although Ireland had declared itself a republic, it stated Ireland was not a foreign country, and Irish citizens in Britain were not aliens. Aliens is just any foreign citizen. They were not aliens, but were to be treated as subjects. In other words, to be treated when they were in Britain as if they were subjects, which is the position of all British citizens. You're not really a citizen in Britain, you're a subject of the monarch, and that's the legal technical term. So immigration controls between Britain and Ireland had been fairly rigorously enforced during the 1940s because of the Second World War. Ireland was neutral, and in return for Ireland operating a similar immigration policy to that of the UK, in fact mirroring it, the UK in 1952 abolished all immigration controls of travel to Britain by anybody if their start destination was Ireland, so creating the common travel area. In fact, it had run since 1922, but was renewed at this point. Now, the long-lasting nature of the CTA has recently been renegotiated as part of Brexit, is due both to the demand for Irish labour at very specific junctures for the British economy and the difficulties of policing the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland and operating immigration controls there. That is a real theme throughout most of the following decades and into the issues around Brexit. So I think one consequence of these peculiar arrangements is that the Irish in Britain have been not seen as proper migrants. However, despite this, despite being EU citizens, despite being treated as subjects, despite being predominantly white, although of course there are Black Irish citizens, but they are in the minority, Irish migrants have long occupied an ambiguous and complex positionality in Britain, and Bronwyn Walter referred to this as how the Irish are simultaneously insiders and outsiders. Images of the Irish as inferior, violent, drunken, dirty, proliferated throughout the British popular press in the interwar years, as they had in the 19th century. But it's very important to stress the interwar years because that was the immediate history when changes took place in how the Irish were positioned in the 1950s. So a review of British political debates and government documents of the 1950s and 60s, these are mostly cabinet documents, reveals that Irish migrants were regarded as much needed labour, but also as prone to drunkenness, nationality, and carriers of TB. And also at this time, the 50s and 60s, historians have accumulated much evidence of signs saying no Irish need apply, or no blacks, no Irish, no dogs signs. And really during this period, and it's traceable through all the cabinet documents, in drawing up the first Immigration Act, well, not the first Immigration Act, but the second of the 20th century in 1962, but a very, very significant one. The government decided to exclude Irish migrants from the main provisions, primarily because of an interest in Irish labour continuing if they were restricting other forms of labour power, given it was labour from Ireland, the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent that really was very instrumental in building the welfare state and in reconstructing Britain after the Second World War. So in excluding Irish migrants from the main provisions, they argued that the population of the whole British Isles is for historical and geographical reasons essentially one. In other words, they were saying that it was essentially one domain, one cultural domain. And part of their evidence, and it's directly quoted here from a cabinet paper, is that an Irishman looking for lodgings is generally speaking not likely to have any more difficulty than an Englishman. This obviously went against much of even the empirical evidence at the time. So essentially what was created at the time, and I'm concertining the explanation, is that a sort of myth of white homogeneity and white cultural homogeneity across the British Isles was erected at this time. And this discourse was really a re-racialising of Irish immigrants. And it's been remarkably unchallenged within sociology. And in many ways, the race relations model that was subsequently handed down based on a fairly rigid black-white dichotomy of understanding those race relations has never really been interrogated fully. And if to the extent it has, it's much more recently. But at the time, many academics accepted it and worked within that framework. And although we're not saying nobody studies the Irish in Britain, far from it, in fact, quite a few studies mention them or include them to a greater or lesser degree, but this tailed away after the 1970s. And the other point is that we're really saying it's not the absolute absence of the Irish in texts, it's the absence of any far-reaching attempts to integrate the findings about the Irish in Britain into an explanatory framework about ethnic and racial studies within ethnic and racial studies within Britain. It's that really that we're centering in on and saying is where the Irish have been marginalised. Now, the other issue we wanted to pick up was on Northern Ireland. Another major failing was the failure to investigate in any way the operation of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and its impact on Irish communities in England. This persisted even after Paddy Hilliard's book, Suspect Community, published in 1993, which tellingly he had found it impossible to gain funding support from, even within his own university, and certainly not from something like the forerunner of the ESRC. And there was no interest in funding it. Very different from today in the last 20 years when, you know, research has been almost an arm of the Home Office trying to deal, in quotes for them, with what they see as Islamic terrorism, many quotes around their statement. Also, another big failing was when, after 9/11, Tony Blair in particular, and he really instigated a new narrative, was that there was a divorce between the era of political violence associated with Northern Ireland and that associated with what he referred to as Islamic terror. So I think he insisted on this differentiation for many reasons, but one is, of course, he sees the Good Friday Agreement as one of the unalloyed triumphs of his premiership. Now, the counter-terrorism measures that have been employed in the last 20 to 30 years, vis-a-vis aimed at primarily Muslim communities in Britain, really were developed under the period of political violence of the IRA in England between 1970s and 1980s. And the impact of such measures, in research I did about 7 years ago with colleagues, is remarkably similar on both Muslims and Irish communities, and the specific details of how individuals or small groups of individuals become aware of being suspect in everyday encounters, neighbours, workmates, in shops, on street, on public transport, usually in the form of being shunned, very common, or verbal or physical abuse. And that really came over strongly as something that combined them. And we had focus groups bringing together young Muslims, actually it was, mostly with older Irish people, people who'd been their age in the 1970s and 80s. And the rapport that was established because of the similarity of their experiences was quite marked. And so we asked, would the slant of the multiple research projects and reports on Muslims, Islamophobia and counter-terrorism in the last 20 years have been different if sociology in England had ever concerned itself with the impact of counter-terrorism measures on the Irish in England from the 1970s? Next slide. So in conclusion, as I've said, it's not the absolute absence of coverage that we're pointing to, it's more the lack of integration, attention, or even realisation of the importance of A, Northern Ireland and its border, and B, Irish migrants, for explaining various aspects of national development and the ethno-racial regime in Britain. And we think if more attention had been given to it, the significance of skin colour in migration history and for ethnic and racial studies would be further enhanced and nuanced. And we also feel that improved sociological understanding of the multiple processes by which Britain has been shaped by constructions of assumed racial difference would also be clearer. And focusing attention on the persisting legacy and continuity of colonialism in Northern Ireland and its consequences for the entire island of Ireland is not just of historical interest, it's a pressing reality in the context of Brexit. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mary and Louise. It's been fantastic. I'm just going to introduce the next speaker, Singh, who's professor at London Metropolitan University. She will talk about her book, No Brave Little Soldiers, Writing Ethics and War Fiction. Singh is a professor of creative writing and inclusion in the arts at the London Metropolitan University. She has authored 3 novels and 2 books of non-fiction. Her essays, short stories, and columns are published worldwide. Singh was the first woman of colour to be elected chair of the Historic Authors Club. She is the founder of the Yalak Prize for the Book of the Year by a Right of Colour, the Yalak Children's and JA Prize, and the Yalak Art Residency. In her various roles, Singh is a champion for inclusion across all aspects of society, advocating an intersectional, decolonizing approach to building radical global solidarity. She's currently finalizing monograph on Indian cinema, as well as a collection of short stories examining aspects of armed conflict over the past century. So thank you, Singh.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you, Louise, for having me here. My presentation draws on the fact that I have multiple hats, and today the hat is that of a writer, a fiction writer primarily. But my practice tends to draw from my work as an academic and the interests that are my research interests there in ideas of representation, popular culture, the way narratives work. So I'll be talking a little bit about that today. I titled my talk No Brave Little Soldier Boys when Louise asked me. And I felt that that was the right way to do it, because I am in the process of finalizing, hopefully in time for the next London Book Fair, if it happens, a collection of short stories. And we have been consistently, my editor and I have been at war, maybe I should say that, about what to call it. I'm convinced that these are war stories. She's convinced that these are love stories set in war. But we will eventually get to it. But I wanted to talk about why I think they are war stories and what the war story is and why I started to write this collection, and a little bit, if we have time, to talk a bit about potentially a specific story as illustration of it. Now, the war story, obviously, we're all familiar with it in the fictional format, whether it's through, films or television or, novels and short stories, or indeed the great epics of the classical era, Iliad, large chunks of Old Testament in India, the large part of the Ramayana and obviously the Mahabharata, has been an essential part of our narrative traditions across the world. Now, I work a lot within the Indian classical aesthetic systems and the rasa theory, and which classifies narratives and creative productions in 9 essential moods or themes or ideals. And of those, obviously love and war narratives are the 2 most popular. And there's an enormous amount of theoretical philosophical work from the classical Indic era prior to 400 BC that constantly goes back as to why, that questions why. But I think when we're writing in the 21st century, as I am, as somebody from a former colony, as a woman of color, multiple areas of marginalization, it opens up the idea of, I can't really go back to the Indic tradition of looking at something like the Mahabharata without a critical eye. I also cannot look at the Western traditions of any narrative without a sense of discomfort and disease. So I started to think about, okay, what exactly how do we construct this narrative? And what does it mean for us? So when we think about it, I mean, the contemporary war narrative owes a lot to really the 19th century. We're looking at, obviously War and Peace, but we're also looking at Red Badge of Courage and Stendhal, and then of course this is massive flowering with the First World War and so on. And it's about the brave little soldier who may die in battle bravely or come back, a hero. There may be, the home front and concerns about, that to keep it safe, so to hopefully, be protected. The concerns about recovery from war and of course surviving war. And there is at the heart of it a kind of quite a distinctly masculine sense of valor. The home front is, it's necessary, but it's the main thrust is still to somehow give succor, moral, emotional, sentimental, political, etc., to the boys who are at war. And my question was, what happens when you have this narrative, and what does it leave out? And of course, as a literature student, I studied primarily Western literature at university, and I kept noticing a few things. What were the silences? Well, the silences were very similar to the silences that we see constantly. Most of these wars ignored the legacies of genocide, of slave trade, of empire. And even when they continued in the 21st century, these were ignored. So you could have, think of the numbers of First World War BBC dramas or movies or novels where the good boys go off to war, and they're very lovely, beautifully dressed women who hold the fort at home. Very few of them mention the role of the empire, not only materially, but in terms of the bodies that went to war for Britain, or for that matter, France, or for that matter, multiple empires. If we get to Second World War, that discrepancy becomes even more glaring. Because at that point, the empire was in different parts, and for different imperial powers, was up in arms. The Bengal famine remains completely unheard of in the Great War novel, because somehow that isn't relevant. So I sort of said, okay, well, we know what some of these erasures are, some of the silences are. I know what the features of the war story is. As I said, the brave soldiers who go off to war, it's always a righteous cause. It's a just war. There are very clear limits. our boys behave nobly, their men are beasts, etc., etc. And I said, okay, what would happen if we ripped it up? What would happen if we entirely ripped up all of this and redid the narrative? What would come out of that if we started to write? Now, of course, the first thing that comes up is the role of non-combatants. Much of the war narrative, starting in the 19th century and beginning in large parts of its imperial foundations, ignores the role of women. Women are often, they are of course the beloved, they are often the victim, often of sexual violence, but of violence. They are to be protected or to be brutalized, but they're really not at the center of the story, except as somehow victims. Think of another set of supposed non-combatants. Children. We all know that Hollywood cliche when there's the big invasion, whether it's horses or it's tanks or it's spaceships. The hero, generally white and straight, very good looking, quite traditionally masculine, races out to somehow grab a child who's going to get run over. There are extra brownie points if the child happens to be seemingly alien, or at least not one of us. That sort of boosts the hero's moral credentials. But I started thinking about going past it, especially since we know very rarely, even historically, even during the empire, these lines of combatants versus non-combatants were not so clear. The lines of traditional soldiers and others were not so clear. All soldiers, even in traditional armies, were not treated equally. The ways in which armed conflict has developed since 1945 across the globe has moved us further away from these clean lines. So what happens if you change that? If you start not from the brave little soldier, not from the boy who's going to become a man somehow through acts of violence, either witnessing or participating in them, mostly participating in them. What if you turn the lens elsewhere? So that's really where the short story collection that I've been working on starts to think of ways we need to look at the world, and we need to look at war. One of the first stories I wrote looked at specifically at suicide bombers. María talked about it, and Louise in their presentation, this complete rupture of considering how we look at terrorism or political violence, or indeed the endless war on terror declared by Bush and Blair. But when we actually start thinking about it, one of the earliest cases of suicide bombing was a Palestinian Christian soldier in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War in the 80s. That technique was then picked up and really developed in incredible ways by both tactically and expressively by not the Islamist terrorists that Blair and Bush and the endless war on terror pointed out to us, but by the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, who, of course, their crushing and the genocide that went alongside it has been one of the quietest points of the last 20 years. And I said, okay, let's start with that. What goes through the mind of someone who is willing to do that. How far would you go? Now, interestingly enough, it took me in terms to research. I can imagine, but I also know that there is no way that imagination is going to be enough. So I started doing a lot of research, looked at enormous amount of work. But what really struck me was a very interesting and deeply flawed book, Shoot the Women First. And perhaps Louise and Mary, it might ring a bell. Partly because it's Eileen McDonald's book, and she looks at specifically women terrorists. And she obviously starts from Ireland. And Shoot the Women First is actually a strategy that the Russians employed at not talking to women terrorists, because the idea was they were too committed to be negotiated with. And that, of course, opens up a whole area of curious, intriguing spaces. And that, of course, took me to international relations, took me to security studies, took me to political science, sociology, psychology. And in some weird way, all of this material then has to be pulled together into a creative work, into a story. And I thought that one of the easiest ways, or perhaps one of the more illustrative ways, would be to actually just look at one story. Not this one about necessarily the suicide bomber, but about something that is quite removed for many of us. The collection is tentatively titled, the working title is A Tango Bar in Buenos Aires. And that was a particular story that I wanted to use because it again picks up on this idea of what happens when we change it? So what happens if we're not doing dig for victory? What happens if we're not sort of doing the straightforward nationalist narrative of, rebuilding Britain or rebuilding whichever country after? And I looked at the dirty war again in Argentina, something that happened following the dictatorship or during the dictatorship, where an enormous number of young dissidents were disappeared by the regime. Many of you may be familiar with the Sting song, They Dance Alone, way back when. They were supposed to be the mothers of the plaza. They are now grandmothers of the plaza, and potentially even, many are dead. And there was a group trying to find these young kids who had been taken from their parents, who had been disappeared, who had been killed off by the regime. And these children had been placed into homes of safe people, often with the military regime itself. And over time, it's become fascinating because they've been pushing to find out who they are. This also means there's legal precedences now with young kids bringing their adopted parents to court, partly because of being removed. So here is another angle that's coming in: human rights, and an expansion of human rights, a constant, ongoing expansion of human rights. And a related part that's come up is now the idea of a DNA bank that is in the main hospital in Buenos Aires, where you can check your own DNA, and it's an enormous bank, and you can access it as somebody who feels that they may have been removed from their biological parents. It opens up a really complex space, not just politically and psychologically, but ethically. And I think this is really important for those of us who know that narratives change the way we look at each other and ourselves, to start considering it. It isn't enough for us to go back and think about the little brave soldier boy. So I'm going to read just a very short bit from the story that I just mentioned to you, and I'll just read a tiny bit. It's called a tango bar in Buenos Aires. And then hopefully I will end on that, and perhaps we can have a conversation rather than me just talking about it. There is a tango bar in Buenos Aires named El Mirador, in the wrong part of town, or at least in the part of town that Gloria does not usually frequent. And yet tonight, once again, she sits outside it, waiting in the car. Her hair is pulled up in a tight conservative bun. A Burberry trench hides the cheap red dress that she hopes will help her blend in with the patrons. The fabric clings to her, itchy and hot, its tawdry sheen embarrassing in its discomfort. She tugs the hem down, then pulls up the neckline, wishing for an instant for her usual clothes, and then feels a flush of shame and guilt. These should have, ought to have, been her usual clothes. The car is borrowed too, from one of the secretaries at work. The seats are cheap vinyl. The engine coughs at the start. The pale pink and blue plastic Virgencita hanging off the rear view mirror makes her cringe. From the shadowed car, she watches the people stream into the Mirador. Women, elaborately, albeit cheaply dressed, their hips swaying unconsciously in the anticipation of music. Men in worn but immaculately maintained old suits and jaunty fedoras, flirting, laughing, calling out indiscriminate, though creatively phrased compliments to the women. The music and the laughter, the elaborate dance of seduction, almost hides the melancholy that Gloria knows dwells just beyond the narrowing circle of light that spills out from the bar. Perhaps tonight she will gather up the courage to leave her car, to ignore the chafing of the dress against her legs, to walk into that circle of light. Perhaps tonight she will go into the Mirador, not to dance, but to be. And this is something that came through quite drastically for me, because it's what happens to people who are taken away and raised in enormous comfort, often luxury, as part of the elite. And yet their parents, who were destroyed by some of that elite, were those from that barrier, where they do dress cheaply, they do dress, they barely have food. What happens to that distance? How do you rethink yourself? So I think a lot of my idea of looking at war and violent conflict is to rethink who we are, because I think that's what shows not just who we are individually, but collectively. I'm going to stop with one last quote, and that probably has informed everything I do in terms of my writing. And it's by James Baldwin. The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter even but a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. So that's hopefully the idea with the war stories. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you so much, the three of you, really. It's been fantastic. Your presentations have been great. And I think, if I may say, before colleagues start thinking about the questions they want to pose to you, if I may say that these three presentations are giving an exact idea about the centre, what we want to do with this centre, isn't it, Liz? It's bringing about so much questions about inequalities and diversities for such a huge amount of perspectives, such a different perspective. I think the three of you have talked about migration, diaspora, official story versus the other story. As Mary said, the non-proper migrants, you see, the non-proper people in this world. You've touched upon cultural studies, social sciences, politics, international relations, psychology, human rights, women's studies, etc., etc., etc. So I'm sure that it's bringing a huge toll to those researchers, those scholars who want to start their research and the conversations, debates about those topics, this is the right place for them. Isn't it, Louise? We've talked so much about it and what we wanted to do with the centre. And this is just fantastic. You've very well summarised the aim of this. And I take your last quote from Faulkner's. It very much invites to rethink all those ideas, all those official schemes on ideas and imaginary and narratives. And this is the place to do that. So I invite colleagues who are on the other side of the screen to post the questions into the chat. Give us a bit of your thoughts and very quickly ask the speakers if you've got any questions, if you want to open discussion about something in particular. And while colleagues are thinking about it, I'm going to be the first one to pose the question to the three of you, really. I the idea of the known, I like very much, I've explored that in my research, the known person, the invisible ones. I'm very much into looking into those and revealed the notion from a different perspective. I can see, Sunny, that you looked into women and the notions of heroes, etc. And I'd like to know, Mary and Louise, how would you reinvent the notion of the Irish migrant? How would you pose this new idea from that perspective, from the invisible ones? What would you highlight here in order to make them visible, if you want?
Would you like Sunny? Sunny, do you want to start answering that?
Ooh,
big question, I know.
Okay, so everything I write seems to be from the about or for and of the invisible ones. And I think there's a couple of things to it. I think sides to it. I think life experiences are always a useful starting point. And then of course you build on them and you learn and you research and you think about it. And for me, I grew up in India. Everybody looked like me. I was from a middle class family, went to school, etc., etc. Turned on, went to the movies, picked up a magazine. People looked like me. And when I was 16, my family moved to New York. And I remember just walking out the first day from the flat and going, I am now officially invisible. Yeah. I don't exist. I didn't exist on television, in books, in magazines, in anything. I just did not exist. And if I did find a glimpse of myself, it was a very distorted, I can't even say, I suppose I could use the word stereotypical, but it was a distortion. It was a mutilated version of myself. And I remember that first instance of recognizing that brutality that had been done. And so for me, that is the starting point of where my interest in focusing on the invisible ones starts. And through my collection, I've purposefully explored stories of those who are invisible. I also look at, one of the stories is, has at its center a mother and daughter who are trying to leave Syria, because that is again, I think that's we are looking at one of the largest migrations in our history, and yet we seem to be completely unaware of it, or we want to position it in ways that denies people their full humanity, that denies the fact that these are people with agency, with passions, with love, with courage, with resilience, and all of the things that we are told are important for humans, and yet we deny that in our storytelling, whether it's through news or through policy making or through the rest of it. And I think for me, that's at the heart of it. Louise, over to you.
Oh, okay. So maybe I'll start, and then Mary can speak after. So yeah, I mean, this issue of invisibility, I think, is really important, because it's even how do we construct a notion of the Irish migrant? What is an Irish migrant? What does an Irish migrant look like? Would you know one if you saw one, kind of thing? And certainly within the literature, such as it exists, there's a very dominant stereotype of the Irish migrant who is male, who works in the construction industry, who is probably hard drinking, quick-tempered, but sings and is entertaining. You know, there's a whole raft of stereotypes there which get bound up in what does an Irish migrant look like. And one of the first studies I did on Irish migrants was actually at London Met with Mary Hickman 20 years ago, and that was looking at Irish women, and really trying to shift that focus and to bring in different voices and to look at the diversity of experiences. And since then, there's been other research which has looked at Irish people through the lens of diversities as well as inequalities, to stick with the centre theme, and to look not just at gender but at sexuality, but also at class. And I know that Breda Gray was here earlier. I don't know if she's still with us, but she's also done research on Irish women and class, the different class, the highly skilled Irish versus the kind of stereotype of the Irish navvy. And so that's without wishing to kind of denigrate any particular notion of what it means to be Irish, but it's about accepting that complexity and that diversity of an ethnicity, which is embodied in so many different ways and in dynamic ways as well. And I'm currently looking at research through the aging process. So it is about challenging, but as soon as you start to challenge, then you immediately add all of that complexity. And then you begin to kind of challenge categories, and to what extent do you then lose any sort of unity or solidarity if you keep sort of finding difference all the time? So that is also a challenge, to sort of say, is there a shared experience? Is there something that unites us while also acknowledging our diversity, our differences of experience, and so forth? So that's a complexity, but I'll hand over to Mary on that one as well.
I was just trying to say that you can be simultaneously invisible and visible in specific instances. So, you know, the Irish were invisible as migrants who are relevant to understanding racism in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, but they were highly visible in discourses on terrorism. And equally in the various stereotypes of the Irish and anti-Irish jokes, which Louise was referring to. So you can be, you know, it's like, you know, there's films where a black woman cleaner in an office is carrying a microphone and no one notices her because she's emptying the waste paper basket. So her job triumphs over her colour in those instances. But in other instances, she would be very visible and reacted to extremely hostilely, maybe. So it's just that you can be invisible and visible in just different scenarios, in different parts of your life and in different public spaces. And I just think, therefore, the idea of a non-person, I mean, we were saying not proper migrants, heavily in inverted commas, because of course, Irish migrants are, in quotes, proper migrants, but they weren't perceived as such. And that's what we were commenting on. So I just think that it's very fluid, these categories. And nearly all people who come from any sort of colonial background experience, invisibility and visibility are, you know, part of the consequence. In different, so it depends on what's determinant in a specific instance.
Oh, thank you so much.
Need to rattle on.
Thank you so much, the three of you. Yeah, I like the idea of being visible and invisible at the same time. Yeah, this is true. There's some people writing on the blackboard. Ayn Woods says that the notion of internalized oppression is an aspect that isn't always addressed. First and second generation, the stereotypical image of the paddy silences so many. Does any one of you want to comment on that? I think it's very, very, very interesting notion, internalized oppression.
I'll just briefly say that I think to understand second generation experiences, you nearly often have to look at, explore how they perceived how their parents were treated. And how my parents were treated is terribly formative and marking and shaping. I have finished. I know you can't see me anymore.
Oh,
I'm going to add to that, to what Mary said. First of all, you know, yes, internalized oppression, and I don't think it's just limited to first and second generation of migrants. I think all colonized people and formerly colonized people carried internalized oppression within ourselves in different ways, which is why decolonization is an ongoing project. But I think one of the issues that happens with migrants especially is a kind of flattening in the discourse, especially in the UK as well as the US, that where differences of class, of gender, of ethnicities, of sexualities, of cultural capital that they may or may not have had access to in their home countries and which they bring with them is almost entirely erased. There's a really interesting report that just hit about how first generation migrants in Britain over the last 20 years are job creators. What it's missing is the fact that, you know, it's been quickly turned into, well, immigrants are great for us. What has been lost is that this is a generation of people who are migrants in a more complex ways, that where they are the investors who are coming into the country with capital, economic, you know, material, as well as educational, cultural, etc. And I think that flattening creates, again, going back to that, you know, invisibility and hypervisibility. So that again becomes a symptom of, you know, this, hey, they're good or bad. Curiously enough, today is the 4th birthday of something called The Good Immigrant, which was possibly one of the game-changing books that came out in the last, you know, of second generation migrants from a huge diaspora, talking precisely about these issues. And in a lot of cases, talking about how their parents were treated. So if you are looking for something to read, The Good Immigrant is the one.
okay. Right. Please, can I ask the audience to write their questions into the into the tab so we can read through them and ask the speakers. I think that while we're waiting, yeah, Shaminda mentions Frantz Fanon, and that he writes about the impact of colonialism on the psyche of the colonized, kind of colonialism of the mind. This is similar to internalized oppression. And absolutely, you're absolutely right. I think we are just moved into this idea of colonialism, post-colonialism. I remember I did a master's degree in post-colonialism, and quite recently I heard they were talking now about post-colonialism, and now I hear you talking about decolonization. So it's just like a never-ending process, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, there are many ways of looking into the internal oppression, which I find extraordinary concept for migrants, second generations of peoples, etc. I also want to, while we're waiting for people's comments and maybe some questions, I also want to highlight something that you mentioned, Sunny, and this is the role of women and how this links into with women's studies. Now that we're moving next way, next month we'll be doing a seminar on gender violence and violence against women in the Global South. Just very briefly, if you could just give your views about the way all this that we've been mentioning about invisibility, hypervisibility, internal oppression, etc. If you could talk a bit about the role of women in all this and how we are reinventing the notion of womanhood and femininity. That would be fantastic. I know I'm just posing 50 questions for two stations, but just
whoa, that's like a huge, that's like, you know, that's an entire term of lectures. But I'm going to try. I also see that there's a question here. So Yolanda, yes, Yolanda,
yes.
that's called a tango bar in Buenos Aires, and it's very much part of the war narratives, because I think we need to think about, you know, the wars that are not formal official wars, and the dirty war was one of them, the La Guerra Sucia, and how do societies then recover from it, and how do people recover from it? So how do we manage to how do we reach a kind of a reparative framework, which will be needed if we want to continue living with each other? And that is, I think, a really complex question, and that fascinates me, so very much so. But going back to you, Maria, I think I was always, you know, even when I was in my 20s, I was very leery of the post as a term. I mean, not as a concept, not as an area of study, but I just found that it sort of positioned certain things and the ways in which, and rather rightly so, because of the way that field of study developed, it limited itself in some ways, and quite rightly so, because it was intended not as an end all, but the start of a process. For me, for example, the most important part of post-colonialism, if you want to still use that term, is the fact that it's often seen as something that happened to the former colonies and not the former empires. I'm interested in how post-coloniality impacts the former empires, Brexit being a good case in point. If there is ever a case for a post-colonial breakdown, this is it. I think it's also interesting for me to then think about how, and which is why I use the term decolonization, because the processes are ongoing. For me, gender is not a kind of a stable, clean category which will just stay. So let's start with the fact that within the constructs of multiple Western feminisms, my status as a woman of color from the former colonies has always been conditional. So unless I am willing to recognize, and I'm willing to fight for the fact that we can't have, rights are not conditional, gender rights cannot be placed conditionally in this kind of idealistic way. They will have to be a constant expansion and fight for expansion of rights. And I also don't automatically think that this differences and saying, look, all women aren't the same is automatically somehow going against solidarities or somehow damaging the sisterhood. Because unless we can commit a framework that constantly considers axis of oppression and therefore constant expansion of rights, we run the risk of replicating oppressive structures, political, economic, social, conceptual. So for me, I think the more important part is to reconsider how we can. I don't think flagging up a difference is necessarily divisive or problematic. I think that is the heart of intersectionality as a theory and a concept of looking at the world. And intersectionality at its core is meant to be a liberationist philosophical construct. So I think that's where I would stand on that. I know gender is a rather large thing. I think there are questions happening, so I will pass it on back to you, Maria.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sunny. Alistair Walsh says the role of academics over the past century in both sustaining and constructing difference and race, and then in the deconstruction of these terms is perhaps significant, perhaps particularly to us today and here as academics with our self-defined focus. Louise?
Well, yes, maybe I can jump in here. I think, again, going back to Brexit, because I think what Brexit has really done is it has shone a light on the importance of history. And as a sociologist, I know Don MacRaild is here, and he would always emphasize the importance of history. And I think as sociologists, you know, we are guilty sometimes of an ahistorical lens, and we don't always understand our history. And what Brexit has done, as we mentioned, as Mary and I mentioned at the start of our presentation, is it has really shown that history matters, that history is not just a legacy, that history has consequences. And the border in Northern Ireland, it really was not a factor very much in Britain during the Brexit debates. There really was very little about how is this going to impact on Northern Ireland. It was a big point of debate in Ireland and of course in Northern Ireland itself, but it wasn't a big issue in the Brexit, in the run-up to the referendum here. And I think that really shows how there was that ignorance and that lack of understanding of why that border and that relationship, which was completely then cross-cut with Britain leaving the EU and the need for regulations along what became a land European border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And so answering Alistair's question, what this really does is it puts the onus on us as academics to ensure that this is something that we are teaching, that we are making sure that that historical legacy is something that's communicated to our students, and that we are framing our analysis as sociologists of pertinent social issues with an understanding of how these issues have come about historically. Why is there a border on that island over there between the north and the south of the country? Where did that border come from? Why is it there? And what really frustrated me, amongst many things that frustrated me in the Brexit debates, was that was being constructed as an Irish problem. And of course, if you blame that as an Irish problem, you are completely exonerating Britain's role in the creation of that border in the first place. So this is why I think we need, as academics, to really address these issues, the legacy of colonialism, decolonisation. They have to be central to what we're doing. Otherwise, we really are not preparing our students for the complex reality, which is not just some kind of distant, arcane debate, but which will impact on their lives as we move further through the new Brexit deal. So I think if we ever needed proof of why these issues matter, Brexit gives us an absolutely prime example of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Does anybody want to add something to Louis' views on Brexit or Sunny's views? Is there any other question? You can raise your hand if you want to and say your question if you want to. If you don't want to write it on the
I think there's a question about intersectionality from Liam Wrigley from the University of Sheffield.
Let me just have a look. I'm wondering, this is for the three of you. Yes, that's right. I'm wondering if intersectionality is salient in all three of your research areas. Who wants to start? Louise? Or
oh, okay. I don't know. Mary, do you want to?
Mary?
Address? I'm happy
I just say yes. I've got nothing to say except yes.
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, I apply an intersectional lens in my own research, and I think it's crucially important to look at these issues through that framework. As Sunny has already talked about the importance of intersectionality, I think sometimes, as we alluded to earlier, when we talk about white migrants coming to Britain, whether it's Irish migrants or indeed Polish migrants, whom I've also researched, there's a risk there that they don't get analysed or researched through an intersectional lens, that's not a lens that is often applied to white migrants. And I think that's why we miss out then on some of the complexities around their contested and conditional positionality. So it's important to bring gender, to bring class, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, all of those issues together, so we get a more rounded picture of those migrant experiences rather than just looking at them in a very one-dimensional way. So class, for example, is something that I'm very interested in my own research, and I think it's very important to keep class along with all of these other really important axes of differentiation, to make sure that class is also part of that, because class and migration, they're very interesting and very shifting relationships there in relation to class and migration. So I won't say any more for now. I'll hand back to Sunny.
Yeah, I actually, thank you. And the answer is, of course, as Mary said, yes. I mean, it would be impossible for me to be in any way involved with post-coloniality or decolonization and not consider intersectionality as a framework, and as it's completely almost foundational to my work. But one of the things I wanted to just quickly bring in, because I'm speaking as a fiction writer today, and I think what is often lost is just how much intersectionality as a framework can help writers of fiction in creating characters that are fully rounded, that fully inhabit the world that you reconstruct around them, and that can actually move as rounded human beings. And so I'm always continually fascinated by writers who kind of go, oh, no, this is too complicated for me. And yet, this is intersectionality as a tool for a fiction writer is perhaps the single most important theoretical framework that we should know. And my poor creative writing students have to deal with it all the time.
Thank you, Sunny. I can't see any other question here. Just a bit of agreement with you. Shaminda says, I agree, Louise, historical contextualization is central to contemporary analysis. An intersectionality approach is extremely important, particularly class, for all migrants.
Sorry, there is a hand up, I think.
Yes.
Is it Klaus?
I think it's Klaus. Klaus, can you hear us? Yes. Klaus, speak slowly. Slowly, Klaus, slowly.
Klaus, there's something wrong with your microphone.
Yep. I know you got overexcited. There must be something with your microphone, Klaus. Turn that off and maybe on. Yeah, we can see you. Try to talk. Try talk. Now we don't hear you. Do you want to write your question?
Klaus, maybe better to write your question.
Well, I think these are the joys of having events virtually. The gremlins have struck.
If it was only now, we did pretty good.
Yeah, I think it worked well up until this point.
And Yolanda, you raised your hand. Do you want to talk? Yeah. Well,
Hi. Hi, while Klaus is trying to chip in. Thank you so much, Mary, Louise, and Suni for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And obviously, because I'm Argentinian, I enjoy quite a lot the narrative, the text that Suni have presented to us. I don't. I understand the. My question was about the war, and let me be briefly and in the context here. My parents were persecuted by the dictatorship, so I know the story. I lived through the story quite deeply. I'm not the daughter of disappearing parents, but I lived through a lot of invisibility phases in my life, especially what I call it clandestine childhood. And perhaps propelled from there, I like to say that the issue of the dirty war is something that is a term that the genocide actually, or the right wingers, the military coup and the defense of establish in our narrative, and it's something that we contest. We call that state terrorism because it wasn't a war really. They use that term to say that there were casualties and to justify during the when they went to justice, some of them, not all of them, to justify their behaviors during the dictatorship. And I'm sure that surely it's not your intention to perhaps to question that. I think I was just trying to think this as a way of translating perhaps from English translations or press or taking new narratives on that, but we really do not consider that being a war. And it doesn't invalidate your narrative. This is what I'm trying to say. It's a bit of a difficult comment for me to make, if you like. It's part of me as feelings, but also enjoying exactly what you do. And I'm sure for listening to all the things that you have said in colonialism, post-colonialism, and all this talk that we had, I'm sure it's not what you are trying to do, let's say.
Yeah, I must say, and I will thank you, and I actually do contest it, unfortunately. And if I were making the same presentation, if I were doing the same presentation in any Spanish-speaking country, especially in Latin America, I would use very different words. I would also do this in Spanish rather than English. So, but you're right. I think one of the reasons that I think we have to be very careful with shorthands. But I think what I find really fascinating, and that's definitely not, at any point in my work, in my narrative itself, the term dirty war doesn't come up. And it's very much, let's say, a dissenting narrative from that of that put out by the state. But I think I think you've just flagged up something really crucial, that no matter, there's constant battle for, getting the truth out, and, what do we do with it? And the words are different. In a completely different scenario, I think there's a short story of mine, which is also included in the collection, which is set in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, and it's set in Barcelona. And it's really struck me when I was there. I did my PhD from Barcelona. About how it's the one story that I'm afraid to read in Spain, because people forget that I'm in the room, and it turns into a hugely emotional issue for everyone in the room, and often quite heavily divided. I don't think Argentina is in the same case, because I think in some ways, you know, that there are parallels and similarities amongst multiple countries across the world. But one of the issues that we constantly have to worry about is exactly how do we name things. And sometimes, and thank you for calling me out on that, taking the easiest shorthand is perhaps not the best way forward. So I do appreciate being reminded of that. And just because I was doing it here in Britain isn't an excuse.
Thank you so much. I can see Louise has his hand raised.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. That was really interesting, and I've learned a lot from that exchange. But I also wanted to say, Yolanda, that this question of what gets named as a war, or how different political encounters become named as war, is obviously a very big contested issue, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Northern Ireland, where, you know, we had the so-called Troubles, and it's, you know, it's always referred to as the Troubles, and, you know, we need to stop and ask ourselves, why is what was effectively a war with, you know, the British Army actively involved in combat, why is that referred to as the Troubles, and it's never referred to, at least never over here anyway, as a war? And so what gets called a war? We call what happened in Falklands a war. We don't call what happened in Northern Ireland a war. It's called the Troubles, which is really such a strange way of describing it. So I really just wanted to come in there and underline that this is an issue that gets played out across many different conflicts, and it is always about who gets to decide how things are named in that situation.
Yes, thank you, Louise. It just reminds me that we had, Svetlana and I, we had a conversation about the notion of necropolitical words, and we had the very same conversation just yesterday about the notion of word, how big it was and how dangerous it was to use in writing, because it could open up a huge discussion among reviewers, etc. So yes, thank you so much. Alistair, but before Alistair, I think Klaus wrote his question. If I could see, if I can find it. Yeah, let me just go back. Klaus, he did his question. Great to see you back, Mary. What did the Irish government think about the friendly embrace of denying Irish difference by the British government?
What? Say that again.
What did the Irish government think about the friendly embrace of denying Irish difference by the British government?
It's written in the chat, Mary. Can you see the chat? Yeah.
No, I can't see the chat. But I was going to say, in public they remained polite, and in privately they were seething.
Yeah.
You know, they were in negotiations. They remained polite, something they didn't learn off the British, and but in private they were seething.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Alistair, you've got your raised hand. Your hand raised.
Just to comment on what Louise was saying now about the Troubles, as they're called in Ireland. None of the colonial wars in the 20th century were ever called wars. There were insurgencies, there were uprisings, there was the emergency in Kenya, and so on. There were none of them were declared as wars. That would have implied something about the nature of the colonial regime that couldn't be admitted.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. But all the more interesting that the Falklands War was absolutely called a war, because again, it was about the other side of the colonial narrative.
Yeah, but it was a war against another potential colonial power in one sense.
Yeah.
It could be construed that way, at least. that's why it could be called a war.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Let me just go to the chat. Does anybody want to say something else? Please raise your hand or write your question. Shaminda, he wrote very interesting questions. I like the title of the research centre. Thank you. I wondered if there is any current research at London Met on the impact of COVID-19 from a diasporic position that takes into account issues of inequality, for example, race and class. This and the BLM is the fight of our lives.
Can I maybe come in and hi Shaminda, it's lovely to see you here today. Yes, so in fact we are bringing together a number of colleagues who are working on different aspects of COVID. I know Yolanda, who was just speaking a moment ago, has been doing some research on social distancing along with our colleague Stephen Hills. So there are a number of colleagues. Gary McLean, who was here earlier, I don't know if he's still here, has also been doing some interesting research and has plans to do further research. So this is definitely something that we have on our radar, and we are talking to various local authorities about how we might take this forward. So absolutely, yeah, it's crucial and it's very much on our agenda. So thank you for mentioning that, Shaminda.
No problem. Thank you, Louise.
Right. As far as I can see, I don't see anybody else with their hand raised or any other question. Maybe, Louise, you want to say something?
Yes. And wrap up. Yes, thank you very much, Maria. It's not easy to chair an event where you've got hands and chat and microphones that may or may not work. So thank you very much, Maria. It takes great calm, skill and professionalism to chair one of these events. So thanks very much for doing that. Yeah, I would just like to thank everybody for coming today. It's been fantastic to see so many people here, both colleagues from within London Met, including our Vice-Chancellor and our PVC for Research and Knowledge Exchange, Lynn and Don, but also so many people from outside London Met. And as Lynn and Don said at the outset, this new centre really does signal the seriousness with which London Met is taking research, providing this new centre as a hub to bring together colleagues who've been kind of beavering away for years and who now will finally get this space where they will be able to come together, network, bring together opportunities for collaboration, both with ourselves, but also externally, of course, with other partners and stakeholders as well. And I would particularly like to direct you, for those of you who are visiting us from outside London Met, to our shiny new website. And a big thank you to our colleague Maiva, who's been absolutely fantastic working with us throughout the summer in preparing for today and in also getting the website up and running. And we've got a programme of seminars and events which will be taking place this semester, which are already up on the website, including a seminar that Maria is organising. And we will have more seminars and workshops coming on stream in the coming months and another programme of activities for semester 2. So it's really exciting. I'm very happy to be back at London Met. I should just say very briefly that I first worked at London Met exactly 20 years ago in the year 2000 when I worked with Mary Hickman. I then went off to Middlesex and then to Sheffield, and now 20 years later I'm back at London Met, and I'm very excited about these new opportunities here, and I genuinely mean that. It's great, and I see so many positive signs, and I think colleagues are so enthusiastic now about the opportunities and the encouragement and support for research at London Met. So I won't say any more than that. Perhaps Maria would just like to say something about the forthcoming seminar, which I believe is taking place in October. Is it, Maria?
Yeah, 28th of October. You will find a link in the website. It will be Professor Liz Kelly from Women's Studies, the big name of Women's Studies, and the head of QASU, the Centre for Women's Studies at London Metropolitan. She will talk about gender violence in the Global South. She She will give a more theoretical perspective about it. And I will talk about the feminicide and gender violence in the northern Mexican border. And I will use Ciudad Juarez as a case study. We've got an external partner in Mexico, a very prestigious center, and I hope we can attract many people. It will be very interesting for those people who are very enthusiastic about conducting this research, and we'll create links. And also many colleagues from London Met who are very keen to hear about all this. So I hope to see you all in the 28th October. Go to the website and you'll have a link there to take your place, because it's going to be busy. I'm telling you in advance.
Thanks very much, Maria. I'm really looking forward to that seminar with yourself and of course Liz Kelly, our great colleague from London Met, who's been doing sterling work over many, many years. So it's great to have Liz on board as well. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. Big thank you to Maiva, but also to our speakers, to Professor Sunny Singh and Professor Mary Hickman, and to my colleague Maria. Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed the event, and we really look forward to seeing you in the future at more Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre events. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.